It's a brand new day, the sun is shining so bright. Wake up.
Mommy, you're here. The small, weak voice of 8-year-old Tommy cut through the sterile silence of St. Mary's General Hospital like a knife through butter, and every single person in that crowded administrative hallway froze. The boy's pale arms stretched out desperately toward Sarah Martinez, a humble night shift nurse who had been standing there just moments before, tears streaming down her face from the brutal humiliation she had just endured. But Tommy wasn't reaching for his real mother, who stood shocked beside his wheelchair, her Chanel purse clutched tightly in her manicured hands. No, he was reaching for Sarah, the woman his billionaire father, Dr. Richard Blackstone, had just finished tearing apart in front of 30 hospital staff members, calling her nothing more than a minimum wage nobody who doesn't belong in a prestigious institution like this. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Blackstone's mouth fell open, his perfectly pressed Armani suit suddenly feeling too tight around his collar. His wife, Victoria, gasped audibly, her diamond earrings catching the harsh fluorescent light as she turned to stare at the nurse she had never bothered to notice before. The other doctors, administrators, and nurses who had been laughing just seconds earlier at Sarah's expense now stood frozen like statues, their cruel smirks melting away into expressions of utter bewilderment. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her uniform, wrinkled from a 16-hour shift, felt even more inadequate now as every eye in the hallway bore into her. She had been working at St. Mary's for 3 years, always keeping her head down, always staying invisible, always accepting the snide comments and condescending looks from the wealthy doctors and administrators who ran the hospital like their personal kingdom. But this moment, this impossible moment, was about to change everything she thought she knew about her place in the world. Let me take you back to where this incredible story began. And if you're enjoying this dramatic tale, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one.
3 hours earlier, Sarah Martinez had been quietly making her rounds on the pediatric ward, her soft-soled shoes squeaking slightly against the polished linoleum floors. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make every minute count, checking on young patients, adjusting IV drips, and offering gentle words of comfort to frightened children and exhausted parents. At 28 years old, Sarah had the kind of natural warmth that made children feel safe and parents feel heard, even though she barely made enough money to cover her rent in a cramped studio apartment 15 miles from the hospital. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her scrubs were clean but clearly worn from countless washings. She drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic that made concerning noises every morning when she started it, and she survived on instant ramen and whatever free food the hospital cafeteria offered to staff during slow periods. But despite her financial struggles, Sarah had something that money couldn't buy. She genuinely cared about every single patient who crossed her path, especially the children who reminded her of the family she had never been able to afford to have. That night, as she was preparing medications in the pediatric wing, she heard crying coming from room 314. Inside, she found 8-year-old Tommy Blackstone, the son of the hospital's most powerful board member and chief cardiac surgeon, Dr. Richard Blackstone. Tommy had been admitted earlier that day with severe pneumonia complications, and his condition had been steadily worsening despite the best care money could buy. The boy was alone in his private room, tears streaming down his feverish cheeks, his small body shaking with coughs that sounded like they came from deep within his chest. His parents were nowhere to be seen, probably attending another one of their endless social functions or business meetings. Sarah's heart broke at the sight of this scared, lonely child, surrounded by expensive get-well flowers and elaborate gift baskets that couldn't provide the one thing he needed most: human comfort. Without hesitation, Sarah sat down beside Tommy's bed and gently took his small hand in hers. "Hey there, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice soft and soothing. "I'm Sarah. I'm going to take care of you tonight, okay?" Tommy looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes, and something in her gentle expression made him feel safer than he had in days. Sarah began to hum a lullaby her own grandmother had sung to her when she was scared, and slowly, gradually, Tommy's breathing became less labored. For the next 2 hours, Sarah stayed with Tommy whenever her duties allowed. She read him stories from a worn children's book she kept in her pocket for nights like this, helped him sip water when his throat felt too dry, and simply sat with him when the fear became overwhelming. She told him about the brave knights and princesses in her stories, painting vivid pictures of adventures and happy endings that made his eyes light up despite his illness. "Are you going to stay with me?" Tommy asked weakly as his eyelids began to grow heavy. "I'll be right here all night," Sarah promised, adjusting his blankets and checking his temperature. "You're not alone, honey. You're going to be just fine." As Tommy finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah noticed something remarkable. His breathing had become more stable, his fever had broken slightly, and the terrified expression on his face had been replaced by peaceful slumber. She had seen it happen before with other children. Sometimes the medicine that worked best couldn't be measured in dosages or prescribed by doctors. Sometimes it was simply the medicine of human kindness, of knowing that someone cared enough to stay. What Sarah didn't know was that Dr. Richard Blackstone had been standing in the doorway for the last 10 minutes, watching this interaction with a mixture of surprise and something he couldn't quite identify. He had come to check on his son after leaving yet another hospital board meeting, expecting to find Tommy being attended to by one of the senior nurses he specifically requested for his family's care. Instead, he found this ordinary-looking woman in budget scrubs holding his son's hand and singing lullabies like she was his mother. What Sarah didn't know was that Dr. Richard Blackstone had been standing in the doorway for the last 10 minutes, watching this interaction with a mixture of surprise and something he couldn't quite identify. He had come to check on his son after leaving yet another hospital board meeting, expecting to find Tommy being attended to by one of the senior nurses he specifically requested for his family's care. Instead, he found this ordinary-looking woman in budget scrubs, holding his son's hand and singing lullabies like she was his mother. Richard Blackstone was not a man accustomed to feeling confused or uncertain. At 45, he had built an empire that extended far beyond his medical practice. He owned 3 hospitals, had investments in pharmaceutical companies, and lived in a mansion that had been featured in Architectural Digest. His wife, Victoria, came from old money and moved in circles where charity galas were social competitions and designer gowns cost more than most people's cars. Everything in Richard's life was calculated, controlled, and expensive. But watching Sarah with Tommy stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. He remembered being Tommy's age, lying alone in a hospital bed after a car accident that had killed his own parents, and how desperately he had wanted someone, anyone, to sit with him the way Sarah was sitting with his son. The memory was sharp and unwelcome, and Richard pushed it away with the practiced efficiency he used to compartmentalize anything that threatened his carefully constructed emotional walls. Instead of gratitude, Richard felt irritation. Who was this nurse to think she could provide better care than the specialists he had handpicked for his son?
Why was Tommy responding to her when the best pediatric doctors in the state had been struggling to get him comfortable? The questions nagged at him as he watched Sarah gently stroke Tommy's forehead, her touch so natural and maternal that it looked like she had been caring for him his entire life. Richard cleared his throat, and Sarah looked up, startled. She immediately stood up, recognizing the expensive suit and commanding presence of Dr. Blackstone, even though they had never been formally introduced. She had seen him from a distance countless times, striding through the hospital corridors like he owned them, which, technically, he mostly did. "I'm sorry, Dr. Blackstone," Sarah stammered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I was just checking on Tommy. His vitals are stable now, and he's sleeping peacefully. I can get one of the senior nurses if you prefer." "That won't be necessary," Richard interrupted, his voice cold and clipped. He moved to Tommy's bedside and placed a brief, awkward hand on his son's forehead, checking his temperature with the clinical detachment of a doctor rather than the tenderness of a father. "His fever has broken. Good. You may return to your regular duties." Sarah nodded quickly, gathering the storybook and water cup she had been using to comfort Tommy. As she moved toward the door, she heard Tommy stir in his sleep, murmuring something that made her heart clench with emotion. "Don't go, Mommy," the boy whispered, his small hand reaching out in his dreams. "Please don't leave me alone again." Both Sarah and Richard froze. The words hung in the air between them like an accusation neither of them was prepared to address. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she couldn't explain, while Richard's jaw tightened with something that looked suspiciously like shame. Neither of them spoke as Sarah quietly slipped out of the room, leaving behind a father who was beginning to realize that all his money and power couldn't buy his son the one thing he needed most, a mother's love. The next morning brought the incident that would change everything. Richard had called an emergency staff meeting in the main administrative corridor to address what he called unprofessional behavior and overstepping of boundaries by certain members of the nursing staff. Word had spread quickly through the hospital's gossip network that Dr. Blackstone was angry about something, and soon nearly 30 staff members had gathered in the wide hallway outside the administrative offices, their faces tense with anxiety. Sarah had been dreading this moment since she left Tommy's room the night before. She knew that powerful men like Dr. Blackstone didn't appreciate being made to feel uncomfortable, even when that discomfort came from witnessing genuine compassion. She had changed into her cleanest uniform and tried to make herself as invisible as possible, standing at the back of the crowd and hoping that whatever punishment was coming would be swift and private. But Richard Blackstone had other plans. When he emerged from his office, flanked by 2 other board members and the hospital administrator, his cold gray eyes immediately found Sarah in the crowd. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Sarah's entire year's salary, his silver hair perfectly styled, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the hallway. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been questioned, "we need to discuss professional boundaries and the importance of staying in one's lane. This hospital has a reputation to maintain, and that reputation depends on every member of our staff understanding their role and limitations." Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized where this was heading. She could see the other nurses exchanging glances, some sympathetic, others relieved that they weren't the target of Dr. Blackstone's obvious displeasure. The doctors in the crowd looked smug, as if they were about to witness a lesson that needed to be taught about the natural order of things in their prestigious institution. Last night, Richard continued, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face, I discovered a member of our nursing staff overstepping her boundaries in a way that was both unprofessional and presumptuous. This individual took it upon herself to provide care beyond her qualifications and to form inappropriate emotional attachments with a patient. If you're watching this and wondering what you would do in Sarah's position, drop a comment below and let us know how you would handle being publicly humiliated by someone so powerful. Sarah felt her face burning with humiliation as every eye in the hallway turned to look at her. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, to run away from this nightmare that was unfolding in front of her colleagues. But her feet seemed frozen to the spot, and her voice seemed to have abandoned her completely. "Nurse Martinez," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension, "would you like to explain to everyone here why you felt qualified to provide specialized pediatric care without supervision? Would you like to tell us all how your minimum wage education and bargain basement training somehow makes you more qualified than the specialists I specifically hired to care for my son?" The cruelty in his words hit Sarah like physical blows. She could see the mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment on her colleagues' faces, and it made her want to curl up and die. She had spent the night giving a sick child the comfort he desperately needed, and now she was being punished for it in the most humiliating way possible. I was just trying to help," Sarah managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "Tommy was scared and alone, and I thought—"
"You thought?" Richard interrupted, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. "You thought? Nurse Martinez, you are not paid to think. You are paid to follow orders, to do basic tasks under supervision, and to stay in your lane. You are not paid to form maternal attachments to patients, especially patients whose families have resources and connections that you couldn't even dream of understanding." The doctors in the crowd were nodding approvingly, enjoying the spectacle of someone being put firmly in their place. Dr. Peterson, a surgeon who had never missed an opportunity to make Sarah feel small, actually smiled as he watched her public humiliation unfold. "Look at yourself," Richard continued, his voice becoming crueler with each word. "Look at your worn uniform, your cheap shoes, your obviously second-hand everything. Do you honestly think you belong in the same social universe as families like mine? Do you think your background of poverty and struggle somehow qualifies you to understand the needs of people who matter in this community?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears that she fought desperately to hold back. She could hear the sharp intake of breath from some of the more decent staff members who were appalled by the personal nature of Richard's attack, but no one dared to speak up against the most powerful man in the hospital. "You are exactly what you appear to be," Richard said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carried clearly through the silent hallway. "A nobody, a minimum wage worker who should be grateful to have any job at all in an institution like this. You are not a doctor, you are not a specialist, and you are certainly not anyone who should be forming emotional bonds with patients who are worth more than you could ever hope to be." The silence that followed was excruciating. Sarah stood there, her whole body trembling with humiliation and pain, tears finally spilling down her cheeks despite her efforts to maintain some dignity. She could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on her, some pitying, some uncomfortable, and some clearly enjoying her public destruction. It was at that exact moment, when Sarah's humiliation was at its peak and Richard's cruelty was on full display, that the elevator doors at the end of the hallway opened with a soft ding.
Victoria Blackstone emerged first, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor, her face set in its usual expression of bored superiority. Behind her, a hospital orderly pushed a wheelchair containing 8-year-old Tommy, who had been brought downstairs for some final tests before his discharge. Tommy was still weak from his illness, his small body dwarfed by the adult-sized wheelchair, but his eyes were alert and searching. The moment he saw the crowd gathered in the hallway, he began looking around with the curiosity of a child who sensed something important was happening. His gaze moved past the doctors, past the administrators, past his own parents, until it landed on the figure standing at the center of all the attention. "Mommy!" Tommy cried out, his weak voice carrying clearly through the silent hallway. "Mommy, you're here!" The boy's face lit up with pure joy as he struggled to get out of the wheelchair, his small arms reaching desperately toward Sarah. The orderly, confused by the sudden outburst, looked around helplessly as Tommy tried to climb out of the chair, his whole body straining toward the nurse who had comforted him through his darkest night. "I knew you'd come back," Tommy continued, his voice filled with the absolute faith that only children possess. "I told Daddy you were the best mommy in the whole world. I told him you sang to me and made me feel better and that you loved me even when I was sick." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the soft hum of the hospital's ventilation system. Every single person in that hallway stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Dr. Richard Blackstone, the man who had just finished destroying Sarah's dignity with his cruel words, stared at his son with an expression of complete and utter shock. Victoria Blackstone's perfectly composed face cracked for the first time anyone could remember, her mouth falling open as she looked between her son and the humble nurse her husband had just finished humiliating. The doctors, who had been smirking moments earlier, now looked deeply uncomfortable, suddenly understanding that they had been party to something far more complex than a simple disciplinary action. Sarah herself seemed paralyzed by the moment, her tears of humiliation now mixing with something else entirely as she looked at the little boy who was calling her mommy with such genuine love and gratitude. Her heart was breaking and healing at the same time, torn between the joy of knowing she had made such a profound difference in this child's life and the horror of having that relationship exposed in such a public and potentially damaging way. Tommy, oblivious to the adult complications swirling around him, continued to struggle toward Sarah with single-minded determination. "Please don't let them take you away," he pleaded, his small voice cracking with emotion. "I need you, Mommy. I don't want to go home without you. You're the only one who makes me feel safe." The words hit Richard Blackstone like a physical blow. He stared at his son, really looked at him for perhaps the first time in months, and saw something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Tommy's face was glowing with love and trust as he reached for Sarah, the same expression Richard remembered having when he was young and desperate for someone to care about him the way Sarah obviously cared about his son. But it was more than that. Richard suddenly realized that in 8 years of being Tommy's father, he had never once seen his son look at him with that kind of unguarded affection. He had never been the person Tommy reached for when he was scared, never been the one whose presence could transform fear into joy. All his money, all his power, all his carefully constructed success, and his own son was calling a minimum-wage nurse Mommy with more genuine love than he had ever shown his actual parents.
The revelation was devastating and illuminating at the same time. Richard felt the foundation of his worldview shifting beneath him as he watched Sarah kneel down to Tommy's level, her face soft with maternal tenderness despite the tears still streaming down her cheeks. "Hey there, sweet boy," Sarah whispered, her voice gentle despite her own emotional turmoil. "How are you feeling today? Are you ready to go home?" "I want to go home with you," Tommy said simply, his small hands reaching up to touch Sarah's face with the innocent trust of a child who had found exactly what he needed in the most unexpected place. "Can I go home with you, Mommy?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge to everything Richard thought he knew about family, love, and what really mattered in life. He looked around the hallway and saw his colleagues and staff members watching him with expressions that ranged from shock to judgment to something that looked suspiciously like pity. The tables had turned so completely that he could practically feel the shift in power dynamics. The way people were now seeing him not as the successful authority figure, but as the wealthy man whose own son preferred a stranger's love to his own. Victoria stepped forward, her usual composure cracking as she tried to process the situation. "Tommy, honey," she said, her voice strained and uncertain, "that's not your mommy. I'm your mommy. Remember? This is just one of the nurses who took care of you." But Tommy shook his head with the stubborn certainty of a child who knew the difference between biological relationships and emotional truth. "She's my real mommy," he said, his arms still wrapped around Sarah's neck. "She stayed with me when I was scared. She sang to me and told me stories and made me feel better when nobody else could. Real mommies don't leave you alone when you're sick." The accusation in those innocent words was unmistakable, and Victoria's face went pale as she realized what her son was really saying. She and Richard had indeed left Tommy alone with hired caregivers and hospital staff while they attended to their social obligations and business meetings, treating his illness like an inconvenience to be managed rather than a crisis that required their presence. Like this video if you've ever felt like an underdog who deserved better treatment than they received, because Sarah's story is far from over. Richard felt something breaking open inside his chest, a wall he had built around his heart years ago when he decided that success and power were more important than vulnerable emotions like love and connection. Looking at his son clinging to Sarah with desperate affection, he began to see the nurse not as an overstepping employee, but as the person who had given Tommy something that all of Richard's wealth had failed to provide: the simple, irreplaceable gift of feeling genuinely cared for. For the first time since the confrontation began, Richard really looked at Sarah, not as a target for his anger or a symbol of everything he thought was wrong with people who didn't understand their place, but as a human being who had somehow managed to reach his son in a way that professional caregivers and even his own family had failed to do. What he saw surprised him. Despite her worn uniform and modest appearance, Sarah had a quality that couldn't be bought or taught: genuine compassion that came from a place of authentic caring rather than professional obligation. Her eyes, even red from crying, held a warmth and intelligence that spoke of someone who understood pain and chose kindness anyway. Her hands, gentle and sure as they comforted Tommy, moved with the natural grace of someone who had been caring for others her entire life, not because it paid well, but because it was who she was. "Tommy," Richard said slowly, his voice much softer than it had been moments earlier, "you need to let go of Nurse Martinez now. She has other patients to take care of, and we need to take you home."
No, Tommy cried, his grip on Sarah tightening. I don't want to go home. Home is scary and empty, and nobody talks to me there. I want to stay with Mommy Sarah, where I feel safe. The words hit Richard like a sledgehammer. His son was essentially telling him that the mansion they lived in, with all its luxury and privilege, felt scarier and emptier to Tommy than a hospital room. The nannies and tutors and housekeepers that Richard paid premium salaries to care for his son had failed to provide the one thing Tommy needed most: genuine human connection. Sarah, who had been silent through this exchange, finally found her voice. Tommy, sweetheart, she said gently, her hands smoothing his hair with maternal tenderness, you do need to go home with your parents. They love you very much, and they've been so worried about you while you were sick. But you love me more, Tommy said with the devastating honesty that only children possess. I can tell. You love me the way mommies are supposed to love their kids, not just because you have to.
The words hung in the air like an indictment of everything Richard and Victoria had thought they were providing for their son. Richard felt a sharp pain in his chest as he realized that Tommy was right. Sarah did love his son, genuinely and unconditionally, in a way that had nothing to do with obligation or expectation. She loved him simply because he was a child who needed love, and that kind of pure, unselfish affection was something Richard had never learned how to give. Victoria was crying now, quiet tears that smudged her perfect makeup as she watched her son choose a stranger over her. "Tommy, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry we weren't here more. I'm sorry you felt alone. But we're here now, and we want to take you home, where you belong." Tommy looked back and forth between Sarah and his parents, his young mind trying to process the complex emotions swirling around him. "Can Mommy Sarah come home with us?" he asked hopefully. "Can she live at our house and take care of me there?" The question was so innocent and yet so impossible that it made everyone in the hallway shift uncomfortably. Richard found himself looking at Sarah again, trying to imagine this humble nurse in his world of marble floors and crystal chandeliers, of charity galas and business dinners. The image should have been ridiculous, but instead he found himself wondering what his house would feel like with someone in it who actually cared about the people living there instead of just maintaining appearances. "That's not how things work, honey," Sarah said softly, though her voice carried a note of genuine sadness that didn't escape Richard's notice. "I have my job here at the hospital, and you have your family and your home. But I'll always remember you, and I'll always care about you, no matter where you are." "Will you visit me?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide with hope. "Will you come see me sometimes and read me stories?" Sarah looked up at Richard, her eyes questioning and uncertain. She was asking permission, he realized, not demanding anything or overstepping her bounds, but simply wondering if she would be allowed to maintain some connection with the child who had obviously captured her heart. Richard stared back at her, and for a moment the hostile authority figure and the humble nurse looked at each other as equals. Two adults who both cared about the same little boy and were trying to figure out what was best for him. In Sarah's eyes, Richard saw no manipulation, no agenda, no attempt to use Tommy's affection for her own gain. He saw only genuine concern for his son's well-being and a willingness to step back if that was what was best for Tommy. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. Sarah Martinez was not trying to take advantage of the situation. She wasn't trying to climb social ladders or gain access to his wealth. She had simply done what came naturally to her when she encountered a scared, lonely child.
She had loved him. And now she was prepared to walk away from that love if it was what Tommy needed, even though it would clearly break her heart to do so. Richard started, then stopped, unsure of how to navigate this unprecedented situation. He had built his entire identity around being in control, around knowing exactly what to do in any circumstance. But this moment had stripped away all his usual certainties. His son loved a woman who was, by all social and economic measures, completely inappropriate for their family. But Tommy's happiness and emotional well-being were more genuine and visible with Sarah than Richard had ever seen them with anyone else, including his own parents. The hospital staff and administrators were still watching, waiting to see how this impossible situation would resolve itself. Some looked sympathetic to Sarah's position, others seemed uncomfortable with the breach of social boundaries, and a few appeared to be enjoying the spectacle of their powerful boss being brought low by his own son's innocent honesty. Dr. Peterson, who had been smirking earlier at Sarah's humiliation, now looked deeply uncomfortable as he realized that the dynamics had shifted completely. What had started as a simple disciplinary action had become something much more complex, a window into the Blackstone family's private failures, and a challenge to assumptions about what really mattered in caring for children. Dr. Peterson, who had been smirking earlier at Sarah's humiliation, now looked deeply uncomfortable as he realized that the dynamics had shifted completely. What had started as a simple disciplinary action had become something much more complex, a window into the Blackstone family's private failures, and a challenge to assumptions about what really mattered in caring for children. Richard made a decision that surprised everyone in the hallway, including himself. "Tommy," he said, kneeling down to his son's level for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, "if it would make you happy, maybe Nurse Martinez maybe she could come have dinner with us sometime. Would you like that?" The offer hung in the air like a bridge being built across an impossible gap. Victoria stared at her husband in shock, clearly struggling to process the idea of inviting a hospital employee into their exclusive social circle. The staff members exchanged glances that ranged from amazement to disbelief, wondering if they had just witnessed Dr. Richard Blackstone, one of the most classist and elitist men in the city, essentially ask a minimum-wage nurse to be part of his family's life. Sarah herself looked stunned, her eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. I don't know if that would be appropriate," she said carefully. "I wouldn't want to overstep any boundaries or make anyone uncomfortable." "You wouldn't be overstepping," Richard said, and he realized as he spoke the words that he meant them. "You've clearly given Tommy something that he needed, something that he paused, struggling with the admission, something that we haven't been able to provide. If spending time with you makes him happy and helps him feel secure, then that's what matters." Tommy's face lit up with pure joy. "Really, Daddy? Really? Mommy Sarah can come to our house?" "Yes," Richard said, looking directly at Sarah as he spoke, "if she wants to." The words carried more weight than a simple dinner invitation. They were an acknowledgement that Sarah had something valuable to offer, that her care and compassion were worth more than all the expensive specialists and premium services money could buy. They were also an admission that Richard's world of wealth and privilege had failed to provide his son with the most basic human need, feeling genuinely loved and valued. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and amazement rather than humiliation. "I would love to have dinner with Tommy," she said, her voice soft but clear, "and with your family, if you're sure that's what you want." "It's what Tommy wants," Richard said, then paused before adding, and I think it might be what we all need."
The admission was perhaps the most honest thing Richard had said in years. Looking at his son's radiant face, at Sarah's gentle smile, at his wife's tear-streaked cheeks, he began to realize that his family had been missing something essential for far too long. They had everything money could buy, but they had forgotten how to love each other in ways that actually mattered. As the crowd in the hallway began to disperse, people returning to their duties with plenty to gossip about for weeks to come, Richard found himself walking beside Sarah as they made their way toward the hospital exit. Tommy was back in his wheelchair, chattering excitedly about all the things he wanted to show Mommy Sarah when she came to visit, his illness temporarily forgotten in his joy at having two worlds come together. "I owe you an apology," Richard said quietly as they walked, his voice low enough that only Sarah could hear. "What I said earlier, the way I spoke to you, it was inexcusable. I was angry and confused, and I took it out on you in a way that was completely inappropriate." Sarah looked at him with surprise, clearly not having expected any acknowledgement of his earlier cruelty. "You were protecting your family," she said diplomatically. "I understand that you are concerned about boundaries and appropriateness." "No," Richard said firmly, stopping to face her directly. "I wasn't protecting my family. I was protecting my ego. I was angry that a stranger had been able to comfort my son in ways that I couldn't, and instead of examining why that might be, I attacked you for it. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology was clearly genuine, and Sarah could see in Richard's eyes that he was struggling with realizations about himself and his family that were probably long overdue, but still painful to confront. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means a lot to me." They reached the hospital entrance, where Richard's driver was waiting beside a black luxury sedan that probably cost more than Sarah made in 5 years. Victoria was already getting into the car, her face still showing signs of the emotional upheaval of the last hour. Tommy was being transferred from the wheelchair to the car seat, his excitement about Sarah's upcoming visit making him more animated than he had been in weeks. "When would be good for you?" Richard asked as Sarah prepared to return to the hospital. "For dinner, I mean. Tommy's going to ask me every day until it happens, so we should probably set a date soon." Sarah smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she had worn since the whole ordeal began. "I work most nights, but I have next Sunday off. Would that work?" "Sunday dinner," Richard nodded. "That sounds perfect. I'll have my assistant call you with the details." As Sarah watched the expensive car pull away from the curb, Tommy's small face pressed against the window waving goodbye to her, she felt like she was living in some kind of impossible dream. Hours earlier, she had been publicly humiliated by the most powerful man in the hospital, reduced to tears in front of her colleagues, and made to feel like she was nothing more than an overreaching nobody who didn't know her place. Now, that same man had apologized to her, invited her to his home, and acknowledged that she had something valuable to offer his family. More importantly, she had discovered that her simple act of compassion had made a profound difference in a child's life, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections could form in the most unexpected circumstances. But if you think this story is ending here, you're in for a surprise, because Sarah's dinner at the Blackstone Mansion would reveal truths that would change all of their lives forever. The Blackstone Mansion was everything Sarah had imagined and more, set on 5 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. The house looked like something from a magazine spread about how the wealthy lived. The driveway was longer than the street Sarah lived on, lined with mature oak trees that had probably been there for decades before the house was even built. As Sarah's old Honda Civic coughed and wheezed up the circular drive, she felt increasingly aware of how out of place she was in this world.
She had bought a new dress for the occasion, nothing expensive, but the nicest thing she owned, and had spent hours trying to make herself look like someone who belonged at a dinner table that probably cost more than her car. Richard answered the door himself, which surprised her. She had expected a butler or housekeeper to greet her, but instead found him standing in the doorway wearing casual clothes that somehow looked more expensive than most people's formal wear. He looked nervous, which was oddly comforting to Sarah, who had been fighting butterflies in her stomach all day. "Sarah, welcome," he said, his voice warmer than she had ever heard it. "Please come in. Tommy's been watching for you from the window for the last hour." The interior of the house was breathtaking, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers, original artwork on the walls, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a palace. But despite its obvious luxury, there was something cold and impersonal about the space, as if it had been designed more for impressing visitors than for actually living in. "Mommy Sarah!" Tommy's voice echoed through the grand foyer as he came running toward her, his face bright with joy. He looked completely recovered from his illness, his cheeks pink with health and excitement. Sarah knelt down to hug him, and as she did, she noticed Victoria Blackstone watching from the doorway of what appeared to be an elegant sitting room. Victoria was dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Sarah made in 6 months, but her expression was uncertain, almost vulnerable, as she watched her son embrace the nurse with obvious affection. "Hello, Mrs. Blackstone," Sarah said, standing up with Tommy still clinging to her hand. "Thank you so much for having me. Your home is absolutely beautiful." Victoria stepped forward, and Sarah could see that she was making an effort to be gracious, despite the obvious awkwardness of the situation. "Please, call me Victoria, and thank you for coming. Tommy hasn't stopped talking about you since we left the hospital." Dinner was served in a dining room that could have seated 20 people, though tonight it felt intimate with just the 4 of them gathered around one end of the massive mahogany table. Tommy insisted on sitting next to Sarah, chattering excitedly about everything he wanted to show her after dinner: his room, his toys, the garden where he liked to play when he wasn't sick. As the evening progressed, Sarah began to see the Blackstone family dynamics more clearly. Richard, despite his wealth and power, seemed unsure of how to connect with his son beyond providing material things. Victoria was clearly trying to be a good mother, but there was a distance in her interactions with Tommy that suggested she had never learned how to simply be present with a child rather than managing him like another social obligation. It was during dessert that the conversation took a turn that would change everything. "Sarah," Victoria said, setting down her fork and looking directly at the nurse, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't think I'm prying. Tommy's response to you is, well, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. You've known him for less than a week, but he trusts you in a way that took me months to develop with him. How do you do it?" Sarah looked surprised by the question, and even more surprised by the genuine vulnerability in Victoria's voice. "I don't do anything special," she said honestly. I listen to him. I pay attention to what he needs in the moment, whether that's comfort or distraction or just someone to sit with him when he's scared." "But it's more than that," Richard interjected, his voice thoughtful. "I've watched other nurses with Tommy, pediatric specialists with years of training, and none of them have been able to reach him the way you did. There's something different about how you care for him." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering how to put her feelings into words. "I think," she said slowly, "that children can tell when someone genuinely cares about them as individuals, not just as patients or responsibilities. Tommy is a wonderful little boy. He's smart and funny and brave, and he just wants to feel like those qualities matter to the people taking care of him." "You see him as a person," Victoria said quietly, and there was something like revelation in her voice. "Not as a problem to solve or a schedule to manage." "Don't you?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious rather than judgmental. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on her son, who was happily eating his ice cream and swinging his legs under the table. "I love him desperately," she said finally. "But I realize now that I've been so focused on doing everything right, the best schools, the best clothes, the best opportunities, that I forgot to just be with him. I forgot that what he needed most was simply to feel loved for who he is, not what he might become." Richard reached across the table and took his wife's hand, a gesture of surprise that surprised Sarah with its genuine tenderness. "We both forgot," he said. "We got so caught up in providing for Tommy that we stopped providing ourselves." The honesty in the room was palpable, and Sarah felt her heart going out to this family who clearly loved each other, but had somehow lost their way in the maze of wealth and social expectations. "It's not too late," she said gently. "Tommy is still young, and he wants to connect with both of you. He talks about you all the time, how proud he is of his daddy being a doctor, how pretty his mommy looks when she dresses up for parties. He loves you both so much." "But he calls you Mommy," Victoria said, her voice breaking slightly. "My own son calls another woman Mommy." Sarah's heart ached for the pain in Victoria's voice. "He calls me that because I was there when he was scared and alone," she said carefully. "But that doesn't mean he loves you any less. It just means he has room in his heart for more than one person who cares about him." Tommy looked up from his dessert, sensing the emotional undercurrents in the adult conversation. "Mommy Victoria," he said, using Sarah's title for his biological mother, "are you sad?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears at hearing her son address her with the same maternal title he used for Sarah. "No, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not sad. I'm just realizing some things." Tommy got up from his chair and went to Victoria, climbing onto her lap with the natural affection of a child who had never doubted his mother's love, even if he had sometimes doubted her availability. "I love you, Mommy Victoria," he said, wrapping his small arms around her neck. "And I love Mommy Sarah, too. Is that okay?" Victoria hugged her son tightly, tears streaming down her face as she realized that Tommy's capacity for love was not limited or competitive. He simply had enough love to embrace everyone who cared for him, and he was asking permission to love them all openly. "That's more than okay, baby," she whispered. "That's beautiful." Richard watched this exchange with an expression of wonder and pain, seeing his wife and son connect in a way that felt more genuine than many of their previous interactions. When Tommy climbed down from Victoria's lap and came to hug him as well, Richard felt something crack open in his chest, a wall he had built around his heart years ago when he decided that success mattered more than vulnerability. "I love you too, Daddy," Tommy said, his small hand patting Richard's cheek with gentle affection. "And I'm glad Mommy Sarah came to dinner, because now we're all together and happy." The simple wisdom of childhood cut through all the adult complications and social anxieties that had been swirling around the dinner table. Tommy saw no conflict in loving multiple people, no problem with having both his biological mother and his honorary mother caring for him. In his world, more love was always better, and the adults around him were making things unnecessarily complicated. After dinner, Tommy gave Sarah the promised tour of the house, his excitement bubbling over as he showed her his room, his toys, and the garden where he liked to play. But it was when they were walking through the portrait-lined hallway that Sarah noticed something that made her heart ache with understanding. There were dozens of family photos displayed in expensive frames, pictures of Richard and Victoria at charity galas, Tommy at various formal events, family portraits that looked more like magazine spreads than casual family memories. But what struck Sarah was how posed and distant everyone looked in these images. Even the candid shots seemed carefully orchestrated, as if the family had never learned how to simply be together without performing for an audience. "That's me at my birthday party last year," Tommy said, pointing to a particularly elaborate photo of himself surrounded by what looked like professional party planners and entertainment rather than friends his own age. "It was really big and fancy, but I was kind of lonely because I didn't know most of the kids there." The admission was heartbreaking in its casual honesty. Here was a child who had been given every material advantage, but who understood, even at 8 years old, that the elaborate celebrations his parents provided couldn't replace genuine connection and friendship. "What kind of birthday party would you want this year?" Sarah asked as they continued walking. Tommy thought for a moment. "Maybe just a small one, with you and Mommy Victoria and Daddy. We could make a cake together and play games, and maybe have a picnic in the garden. That sounds more fun than having strangers in fancy clothes pretending to have fun." Sarah realized that Tommy had somehow managed to see through all the social pretension that surrounded his life and identify what really mattered to him: authentic relationships with people who genuinely cared about him as a person rather than as an accessory to his parents' social status. When they returned to the sitting room, they found Richard and Victoria deep in conversation, their voices low and serious. They looked up as Tommy and Sarah entered, and Sarah could see that both parents had been crying. "We've been talking," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the evidence of tears on her cheeks, "about our family, about the way we've been living, about what Tommy really needs from us." "And what we need from each other," Richard added, looking at his wife with an expression of love and understanding that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. Tommy climbed onto the couch between his parents, settling in with the contentment of a child who felt secure in their affection. "What did you decide?" he asked, with the direct curiosity that only children possess. Richard and Victoria exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes before Richard spoke. "We decided that we want to be a real family," he said. "Not just people who live in the same house and go to the same events, but people who actually know each other and spend time together and care about what's happening in each other's lives." "That sounds good," Tommy said approvingly. "Can Mommy Sarah be part of our real family too?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Tommy, honey," she said gently, "your parents need to focus on being a family together. I can still be your friend and visit sometimes, but—" "Actually," Richard interrupted, his voice thoughtful, "maybe Tommy's onto something."
Sarah looked at him in surprise, not sure where this conversation was heading. "Not in the way Tommy's thinking," Richard clarified quickly, seeing Sarah's expression. "But you've shown us something important about what it means to really care for someone, to put their emotional needs first. Would you consider helping us learn how to do that better?" "I don't understand," Sarah said, genuinely confused. Victoria leaned forward, her expression earnest. "We want to hire you," she said, "not as a nanny or a housekeeper, but as someone who can teach us how to be the kind of parents Tommy deserves. You have something we've somehow never learned, the ability to connect with him in ways that make him feel truly valued and loved." Sarah stared at them, trying to process what they were suggesting. "You want to pay me to teach you how to love your own son?" "We want to pay you to teach us how to love him better," Richard corrected.
We already love him desperately, but clearly we don't know how to show that love in ways that actually reach him. You do." The offer was unprecedented and slightly surreal, but as Sarah looked at the three faces watching her hopefully, she began to understand what they were really asking. They weren't trying to buy her affection or outsource their parental responsibilities. They were acknowledging that something essential had been missing from their family dynamic and asking for help in finding it. "I would need to keep working at the hospital," Sarah said slowly. "That's important to me." "Of course," Victoria nodded. "We're not asking you to give up your career. We're asking you to help us become better at ours, being parents." "And honestly," Richard added, his voice carrying a note of humor for the first time all evening, "after watching you with Tommy, I'm starting to think some of the doctors at the hospital could learn a few things from you about patient care, too." Tommy, who had been listening to this adult conversation with the focused attention of a child who sensed his happiness hung in the balance, suddenly spoke up. "Does this mean Mommy Sarah will come to dinner all the time now?" "If she agrees to help us," Victoria said, looking at Sarah hopefully, "then yes, she'll be spending a lot more time with us."
Tommy's face lit up with pure joy, and he launched himself at Sarah with a hug that nearly knocked her off the couch. "Please say yes, Mommy Sarah, please. We'll be the best family ever if we're all together." Sarah found herself crying again, overwhelmed by the generosity and trust these people were showing her, and by the love of a little boy who had somehow seen past all the social and economic barriers that should have kept them apart. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I'd love to help." The months that followed were unlike anything Sarah could have imagined. She maintained her position at the hospital, but her off hours were increasingly spent with the Blackstone family, helping them discover how to simply be together without the elaborate structures and social expectations that had previously defined their relationships. She taught Richard how to read bedtime stories with the kind of dramatic voices that made Tommy giggle and beg for just one more chapter. She showed Victoria how to bake cookies with Tommy in the kitchen, how the mess and laughter were more important than the perfect results they had previously expected from everything they did together. Most importantly, she helped them all learn how to talk to each other, really talk about feelings and fears and dreams, rather than just managing schedules and social obligations. The change in Tommy was remarkable. The anxious, lonely child who had clung to Sarah in the hospital became a confident, joyful boy who felt secure in his parents' love and attention. He still called Sarah Mommy Sarah and maintained a special bond with her, but his relationship with Victoria and Richard grew stronger and more authentic with every passing day. Richard found himself looking forward to coming home from the hospital, eager to hear about Tommy's day and to spend time with his family in ways that felt genuine rather than obligatory. Victoria discovered that she actually enjoyed the messiness and unpredictability of real family life more than the perfectly orchestrated social events that had previously filled her calendar. And Sarah? Sarah found herself falling in love, not just with Tommy, who had captured her heart from their first meeting, but with the whole process of watching a family discover how to love each other better. It was during one of their regular Sunday dinners, about 6 months after that first awkward meal, that Richard made an observation that surprised everyone at the table. "You know," he said, looking around at Victoria, Tommy, and Sarah with an expression of contentment Sarah had never seen on his face before, "this feels like the first real family dinner we've ever had." "That's because we're finally acting like a real family," Victoria said, smiling at her husband with genuine affection, instead of just playing roles. Tommy, who was now comfortable enough to interrupt adult conversations when he had something important to say, looked up from his meal with serious eyes. "Are we going to be a real family forever?" he asked. "Forever and always," Richard promised, reaching over to ruffle his son's hair in a gesture that had become natural rather than forced. "Even Mommy Sarah?" Tommy pressed, because children never let important questions go unanswered. Richard and Victoria looked at Sarah, and she could see in their expressions that they had been thinking about this question too. Over the months of working together to rebuild their family relationships, something deeper had been developing. Not just gratitude for Sarah's help, but genuine affection and respect for who she was as a person. But it was Richard's next words that changed everything. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying a note of nervous determination that made everyone at the table look at him more closely, "I've been thinking about that. About Sarah being part of our family permanently." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made Victoria gasp and Tommy's eyes go wide with excitement. "Sarah Martinez," Richard said, getting up from his chair and moving to kneel beside hers. "You came into our lives when we desperately needed to learn how to love each other better. You taught us what it means to put someone else's needs first, to care for each other with genuine tenderness and patience. You showed Tommy what it feels like to be truly valued, and you showed Victoria and me what we had been missing in our relationship with our son and with each other." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as she realized what was happening, tears streaming down her face as Richard continued. "But somewhere along the way, you became more than just our teacher or our friend. You became the heart of our family, the person who makes everything feel complete and right. I love the way you laugh at Tommy's silly jokes, the way you encourage Victoria's attempts at cooking, the way you make our house feel like a home instead of just a showcase." He opened the box, revealing a ring that was beautiful without being ostentatious, elegant without being flashy. "I love you, Sarah, not because of what you've done for my family, but because of who you are. You're kind without being naive, strong without being hard, generous without expecting anything in return. Will you marry me and make this family official?" The proposal was so unexpected and yet so right that Sarah felt like her heart might burst with happiness. Looking around the table at Tommy's excited face and Victoria's tearful smile, she realized that this wasn't just Richard asking her to marry him. It was a whole family asking her to be part of them forever. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, of course, yes." Tommy cheered and clapped his hands as Richard slipped the ring onto Sarah's finger, and Victoria came around the table to hug them both, tears of joy streaming down her face. "This is the best day ever," Tommy declared, bouncing in his chair with excitement. "Now I have 2 mommies and a daddy, and we're all going to live together forever." Richard stood up and pulled Sarah into his arms, kissing her with all the love and gratitude he had been holding back for months. When they broke apart, both of them crying and laughing at the same time, Sarah looked around at her new family, really her family now, and marveled at how much had changed since that horrible day in the hospital hallway. "I love you too," she told Richard, her voice shaky with emotion. "All of you. I never dreamed that helping one scared little boy could lead to finding the family I always wanted." "You didn't just find us," Victoria said, her voice warm with affection. "You created us. You showed us how to be the family we were always meant to be." The wedding, when it took place 3 months later, was everything the Blackstone family's previous events had not been. Small, intimate, and focused entirely on the love and joy of the people involved,
rather than on impressing an audience. Tommy served as ring-bearer, beaming with pride as he watched his two mothers and father officially become a family. Sarah kept her job at the hospital, but now she worked there as Dr. Sarah Blackstone, respected not just for her compassion, but for the expertise in family care that she had developed through her unique experience. Richard established a foundation that provided family counseling and support services to struggling families, using Sarah's insights about the importance of emotional connection to help other families find their way to each other. Victoria threw herself into charity work that actually mattered to her, focusing on organizations that helped single mothers and children in need, drawing on her own experience of learning what it meant to really prioritize family relationships. And Tommy? Tommy grew up secure in the love of his parents and his honorary mother, confident in his worth as an individual, and equipped with the emotional intelligence to form meaningful relationships throughout his life. The humble nurse who had once been publicly humiliated for caring too much had become the foundation of a family that learned to love without limits, proving that sometimes the most powerful transformations come not from wealth or status, but from the simple courage to show up for each other with authentic compassion. Years later, when people asked Sarah about the secret to her family's happiness, she would always give the same answer. We learned that love isn't something you have to earn or deserve. It's something you give freely. And when you do that, it comes back to you in ways you never expected. The story of Sarah Martinez and the Blackstone family became something of a legend at St. Mary's General Hospital, told and retold by staff members who had witnessed that incredible day in the administrative hallway. But for the family itself, it wasn't a story at all. It was simply their life, built on the foundation of one nurse's willingness to love a scared little boy and one family's courage to let that love transform them all. But the real transformation in the Blackstone family was still unfolding in ways that would surprise everyone who thought they knew how this story would end. Because 6 months after the wedding, Sarah discovered she was pregnant, and the joy that filled their home was unlike anything any of them had ever experienced. Tommy was beside himself with excitement at the prospect of becoming a big brother, spending hours talking to Sarah's growing belly and making elaborate plans for all the things he would teach his new sibling. Richard found himself marveling at the way pregnancy seemed to make Sarah glow with happiness, her natural maternal instincts expanding not just the child she was carrying, but the entire family that had embraced her. Victoria surprised everyone, including herself, by how naturally she took to the role of grandmother-to-be, shopping for baby clothes and nursery decorations with an enthusiasm she had never shown for Tommy's elaborate childhood celebrations. She had learned the difference between providing things and providing love, and she was determined to get it right this time from the very beginning. The baby, when she arrived, was a perfect blend of Sarah's gentle spirit and Richard's determined personality, with Tommy's bright curiosity shining in her eyes from the moment she opened them. They named her Hope because that was what she represented to all of them, proof that families could be built on love rather than obligation, that second chances were real, and that sometimes the most beautiful things in life came from the most unexpected circumstances. Tommy appointed himself Hope's chief protector and entertainment director, reading her stories with the same dramatic voices Sarah had taught him to love, singing the lullabies Sarah had hummed to him during his darkest nights in the hospital. Watching her son with his baby sister, Victoria finally understood what Sarah had been trying to tell her about the difference between managing a child and loving one unconditionally. The first time Hope laughed, a bright, gurgling sound of pure joy,
She was looking directly at Tommy as he made silly faces for her entertainment. Richard, who happened to be holding her at the time, felt tears streaming down his face as he realized that this was what he had been missing during Tommy's early years. Not the milestones and achievements that could be photographed and framed, but these small, perfect moments of connection that couldn't be bought or scheduled or controlled. Sarah, watching from the doorway as her husband held their daughter while their son entertained her, felt a contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. This was what she had dreamed of during all those lonely nights in her cramped apartment, working double shifts and wondering if she would ever have a family of her own. Not just any family, but this family, complicated and unexpected and more loving than anything she could have imagined. As Hope grew from infant to toddler, the house that had once felt like a cold museum became filled with the comfortable chaos of real family life. Toys appeared in the formal living room. Crayon drawings were proudly displayed alongside expensive artwork, and the pristine kitchen became the scene of regular baking disasters that everyone remembered more fondly than any perfect catered event they had previously hosted. Richard found himself coming home for lunch just to spend a few extra minutes watching Sarah help Hope take her first steps, or to hear Tommy read his school report aloud with pride, or simply to sit in the garden with Victoria and talk about their day, like couples do when they actually care about each other's experiences. The transformation in his marriage was as dramatic as everything else. Victoria had blossomed into the warm, engaged partner he had always hoped for but never known how to encourage. Tommy, now 10 years old and wise beyond his years, often served as the family's unofficial historian, telling Hope stories about the day Mommy Sarah came to dinner and how everything changed after that. He would show his little sister the hospital where he first met Sarah, explaining with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood that their family was special because it was built on love that chose them rather than love that was expected.
Sarah's colleagues at St. Mary's General Hospital watched this transformation with a mixture of amazement and inspiration. The same nurse who had once been humiliated in their hallways was now one of the most respected members of their staff, not just because she had married well, but because her experience had given her insights into patient care and family dynamics that made her invaluable to the institution. She started a program at the hospital called Heart to Heart, which paired nurses with patients and families who needed extra emotional support during difficult medical situations. The program was revolutionary in its simplicity. It recognized that healing involved more than medical procedures, that sometimes what patients needed most was someone who would sit with them, listen to them, and remind them that they were valued as human beings beyond their illnesses. Dr. Peterson, who had once smirked at Sarah's public humiliation, now regularly requested her consultation on his most challenging pediatric cases. He had learned, somewhat humiliatingly for his own ego, that medical expertise meant nothing if you couldn't connect with your patients in ways that made them feel safe and understood. Richard himself had evolved as both a doctor and a hospital administrator, using his authority to create an institutional culture that valued compassion alongside competence. The hospital that had once been notorious for its cold efficiency became known throughout the state for its innovative approach to patient care, attracting medical professionals who wanted to work in an environment where kindness was considered as important as clinical skill. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the community's perception of the Blackstone family itself. Where they had once been known primarily for their wealth and social status, they were now recognized for their philanthropy and genuine commitment to helping families in crisis.
Their annual charity gala, which had previously been a stiff social obligation, became a joyful celebration that raised millions of dollars for family counseling services, single mother support programs, and children's healthcare initiatives.
Sarah often spoke at these events, telling her own story as an example of how unexpected connections could transform lives in ways that no amount of money could accomplish alone. Her speeches were never polished or professionally written, but they came from the heart in ways that moved audiences to both tears and action. I used to think that love was something rare and precious that only came to lucky people, she would say, standing at podiums in ballrooms that had once intimidated her, but now felt like natural extensions of her mission to help others. I thought that families like the one I grew up dreaming about were only possible in fairy tales or for people who were born into different circumstances than mine. The audiences, made up of wealthy donors, hospital staff, community leaders, and families who had benefited from the programs the foundation supported, would listen with rapt attention as Sarah continued. But what I learned is that love isn't something you find or something you deserve based on your background or your bank account. Love is something you create by choosing to see the worth in other people and by being brave enough to let them see the worth in you. Sometimes that means sitting with a scared child in a hospital room. Sometimes it means swallowing your pride and asking for help in becoming a better parent. Sometimes it means opening your heart to people who look different from you or come from different worlds than yours. She would pause then, looking out at the crowd with the same gentle confidence she had once brought to Tommy's bedside. Tommy taught me that children don't care about social status or economic differences. They care about feeling safe, feeling valued, and feeling loved. Adults could learn a lot from that kind of clarity. The applause that followed these speeches was always thunderous, but more importantly, the programs they supported continued to grow and help more families each year. Sarah's story had become a catalyst for real change in how their community thought about family support, healthcare, and the importance of emotional connection and healing.
Tommy, now old enough to understand the broader impact of his family's work, often accompanied Sarah to these speaking events, usually carrying hope on his shoulders so she could see the crowds of people who came to hear about love conquering all kinds of obstacles. He was proud of his family's story, but more than that, he was proud of the way they lived it every day. At home, the Blackstone family had established traditions that honored both their past and their future. Sunday dinners remained sacred family time, but now they often included friends, colleagues, and sometimes families who were struggling and needed to see what healthy family dynamics looked like. Their table, which had once been a showcase for expensive china and formal etiquette, became a place where laughter was more important than perfect manners, and where everyone felt welcome to share their joys and concerns. Hope's second birthday party was everything Tommy's early celebrations had not been. Small, intimate, focused entirely on the birthday girl's delight rather than on impressing guests or creating photo opportunities. The backyard was decorated with balloons and handmade banners. The cake was slightly lopsided because Victoria had insisted on making it herself, and the guest list included hospital staff, neighborhood children, and extended family members who had been drawn into the Blackstones' expanding circle of love. As Sarah watched her daughter toddle around the garden, chasing bubbles that Tommy was blowing for her, while Richard and Victoria laughed at her delighted squeals, she reflected on how dramatically her definition of wealth had changed. 3 years ago, she had measured her poverty in terms of what she couldn't afford, a nice car, decent clothes, a home she owned rather than rented. Now she understood that she had been rich all along in the ways that actually mattered, and that her current abundance wasn't about the mansion she lived in or the security of her bank account, but about the love that surrounded her family every single day. Richard, catching her contemplative expression from across the garden, made his way over to her with the easy affection that had become natural between them. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Blackstone?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they watched their children play.
"Just remembering that scared nurse who used to drive home crying after particularly difficult days at the hospital," Sarah said, leaning back against her husband's chest. "She never could have imagined this life." "That scared nurse," Richard said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "was exactly who we needed her to be. She just didn't know it yet." Victoria approached them, her designer clothes slightly rumpled from playing with Hope, her perfectly styled hair mussed from chasing toddlers, and her face glowing with the kind of happiness that no amount of money had ever been able to buy her. "Did I miss a sentimental moment?" she asked, with a smile that held nothing but genuine warmth. "Just appreciating how far we've all come," Sarah replied, reaching out to include Victoria in their family embrace. "And how far we're going," Richard added, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had learned that the best adventures were the ones you shared with people you loved. Tommy, who had inherited his father's ability to sense when important family moments were happening, abandoned his bubble-blowing duties and came running over with Hope in his arms. "Group hug," he declared, and soon all 5 members of the Blackstone family were tangled together in the kind of embrace that felt like home itself. As the sun set over their garden, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed designed specifically for this moment, Sarah realized that she had finally found the answer to the question that had haunted her for so many years. She did deserve love, not because of anything she had accomplished or any role she had filled, but simply because she existed, and because she had chosen to love others with courage and authenticity. The little girl who had grown up poor and lonely, the young woman who had worked multiple jobs while putting herself through nursing school, the dedicated healthcare worker who had been publicly humiliated for caring too much, she had always been worthy of the love she now experiences every day. She had just needed to find the people who were wise enough to recognize that worthiness and brave enough to build a family around it. Tommy, who would grow up to become a pediatrician himself, following in his father's footsteps, but with his mother Sarah's gift for emotional connection, would later say that his earliest memory was not of fear or illness, but of a nurse with gentle hands and a warm voice who made him feel safe in the scariest moment of his young life. He would spend his career trying to provide that same sense of safety to other children, understanding that healing was as much about love as it was about medicine. Hope, who would become a social worker specializing in family reunification, would grow up hearing the story of how her family came together and would dedicate her life to helping other families find their way to each other across seemingly impossible divides. She would carry forward her mother's legacy of seeing worth in every person and her father's determination to use privilege responsibly. Victoria, who had discovered that her real talent lay not in managing social events, but in genuinely caring for people in crisis, would eventually become the director of the Family Foundation, using her organizational skills and social connections to create programs that touched thousands of lives. She would often tell people that she learned everything she knew about love from watching a hospital nurse care for her son. And Richard?
Richard would become known not just as a successful surgeon and hospital administrator, but as a man who had the wisdom to recognize when someone else could teach him something important about life. His leadership style, which had once been based on authority and intimidation, evolved into something based on collaboration and genuine respect for every person's contribution. But all of that was still in the future. On this particular evening, as the Blackstone family held each other close in their garden, while Hope babbled happily about the bubbles she had been chasing, and Tommy planned elaborate adventures he wanted to share with his little sister, they were simply a family grateful for the love they had found in each other. The story that had begun with public humiliation and a child's desperate cry for comfort had become something much larger. A testament to the power of authenticity over appearances, of kindness over status, of choosing love even when it seemed impossible or inappropriate or socially unacceptable.
Years later, when Sarah was invited to speak at nursing schools across the country, she would always end her presentations with the same message that had guided her through her own transformation from lonely outsider to beloved family member. Your worth is not determined by other people's recognition of it. Your capacity to love and be loved is not limited by your circumstances or background. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply show up for someone who needs you, even when you don't think you have anything valuable to offer. You never know when your simple presence might be exactly what someone's heart has been waiting for. The students would leave these presentations inspired, not just by Sarah's success story, but by the reminder that every patient they would encounter, every family they would serve, every moment of care they would provide could be the beginning of something transformative. Love, they learned, was not just something that happened to lucky people. It was something you created by choosing to see and value the humanity in everyone you met. And sometimes, if you were very blessed and very brave, that love would come back to you in ways you never expected, creating families and futures more beautiful than anything you ever dared to dream. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that love can triumph over prejudice and that kindness is never wasted, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of compassion. Stories like Sarah's happen every day in small ways. Nurses who go beyond their job descriptions, families who learn to love better, people who choose connection over division. Your own act of kindness might be the beginning of someone else's transformation story. Stay tuned for our next inspiring tale about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And remember that you never know when your simple act of kindness might change someone's entire world.